July 12th, 1944. St. Lo, Normandy, France. The steel spoon in Demetrios Haritos' hand bent as he slammed it against the rim of the field kitchen pot, his knuckles white with frustration. The 35-year-old mess sergeant cursed in a mixture of Greek and English as he surveyed the chaos around him. 6 smoking field stoves, 20 exhausted KPs, and 3,000 hungry soldiers waiting in a line that stretched beyond his vision through the muddy Norman field. "Sergeant Haritos, where's my damn breakfast?" Colonel Whitaker's voice cut through the cacophony of bubbling pots and sizzling grills. "I've got men who haven't eaten a hot meal in 3 days. They're moving out in 90 minutes. Haritos straightened his food-stained uniform and met the colonel's gaze. "Sir, we're cooking as fast as these stoves allow." Standard Army field kitchen wasn't designed to feed a regiment in one sitting. The rain that had fallen throughout the night made everything worse. Wet wood smoked instead of burned, mud turned the cooking area into a swamp, and humidity prevented anything from staying crisp. The smell of half-burned food mixed with diesel exhaust from nearby trucks created a noxious cloud that hung over the entire operation. "I need solutions, not excuses," Whitaker snapped, rainwater dripping from his helmet. "Those boys are about to push through German lines. They need calories." Haritos nodded, watching the colonel stride away. He knew the stakes. A hungry soldier was a dead soldier. Combat effectiveness dropped by 40% after 18 hours without proper nutrition. He had seen the studies. The Third Army was advancing rapidly across France, outrunning its supply lines, creating a logistical nightmare that landed squarely on the shoulders of men like him. The M1937 field kitchen, standard issue for the US Army, could handle about 250 men per unit under ideal conditions. Haritos had 6 units running simultaneously, which should have been enough for 1,500 soldiers. But ideal conditions didn't exist in Normandy in July 1944, and somehow he needed to feed 3,000 men before they moved out. "Carlson!" Haritos shouted to his assistant. "Take over stirring. If that oatmeal burns, I'll have you peeling potatoes until Christmas." Haritos moved between the stoves, adjusting flames, testing consistency, barking orders to his team. His forearms bore the scars of 20 years in kitchens, burns from Chicago's busiest restaurants, cuts from his family's diner on Halsted Street. But nothing had prepared him for this scale, this pressure, this constant grinding impossibility. 50 yards away, the motor pool was alive with activity. Mechanics worked on jeeps and trucks, replacing parts, modifying engines to handle the punishing Norman roads. Haritos paused, watching a team disassemble and reassemble a transmission in under 20 minutes. Their movements choreographed with precision, born from necessity and practice. Something clicked in his mind. "Johnson," he called to one of his cooks, "how long does it take to cook a single pot of stew?" 45 minutes, Sarge, you know that." "And how many men can eat from that pot?" "About 40, if we're being generous with portions." Haritos did the mental calculation. At that rate, feeding 3,000 men required 75 cooking cycles. Impossible with current methods. He watched the mechanics again, the way they had specialized tasks, the way components moved from station to station in a continuous flow. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. "Dmitri, cooking is not about the recipe, it's about the system." The idea forming in his mind was ridiculous by Army standards, a complete violation of Quartermaster Corps procedures. But he wasn't in a classroom at Fort Lee anymore. He was in France with thousands of hungry soldiers and equipment that couldn't meet the demand. Little did the exhausted men waiting in that endless chow line know that the cursing Greek-American sergeant was about to revolutionize how armies ate, turning impossible feeding schedules into routine operations, and eventually touching the lives of every American soldier in the European theater. Haritos wiped his hands on his apron and began sketching in the small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. By morning, he would either be relieved of duty or change military food service forever. February 12, 1917. Chicago, Illinois. The aroma of roasting lamb and garlic filled the small apartment above Haritos' family restaurant on South Halsted Street. 6-year-old Demetrios stood on a wooden crate beside his grandmother, Yaya Eleni, watching as her weathered hands kneaded dough for spanakopita with practiced efficiency. Outside, snow fell on the streets of Chicago's Greektown, but inside, steam-clouded windows and warmth emanated from both the ancient cast-iron stove and the matriarch who commanded it. "Watch closely, Dmitri," Yaya said in Greek, her accent thick despite 15 years in America. "Cooking is not about the food, it's about the system." Her fingers moved in a blur, folding phyllo dough around spinach and feta with mathematical precision. "See how I prepare all ingredients first? How I organize my workspace? This is how we feed many people quickly." The lesson wasn't academic. On Sundays, the Haritos restaurant served over 500 customers, mostly fellow Greek immigrants, who came after church for a taste of the homeland. Young Demetrios spent those days running between kitchen and dining room, watching his father Christos manage the front, while Yaya orchestrated the kitchen with the authority of a general commanding troops. By age 16, Demetrios had developed hands that could withstand scorching heat and a mind that instinctively calculated timing, yield, and scale. While other boys played baseball, he studied the mechanics of mass feeding, how to turn 30 pounds of beef into 200 identical portions, how to synchronize 5 different dishes to finish cooking simultaneously, how to keep food hot without compromising quality. His father had other ambitions for him. "Americans respect education," Christos insisted, enrolling his son in engineering classes at Lane Technical High School alongside his kitchen duties. The combination proved fortuitous. Demetrios approached cooking with an engineer's mind, seeing inefficiencies where others saw tradition. After graduation in 1934, amid the Great Depression's grip on Chicago, Demetrios secured a coveted spot at the Culinary Institute. There, he encountered classical French techniques that contradicted his grandmother's practical methods. "Too slow," he muttered during demonstrations, earning reprimands from instructors who prize perfection over production. During his final year, the prestigious Palmer House Hotel hired Demetrios as a line cook. The hotel's kitchen served 2,000 guests daily, operating with military-like discipline. Executive chef Maurice Fontaine recognized the young Greek-American's talent for high-volume production and placed him in charge of banquet preparation. "Your grandmother was right about systems," Fontaine told him, after Demetrios successfully executed a 12-course dinner for 700 guests. "But you must understand why each system works. That is your gift." When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Demetrios didn't hesitate. At 29, he was older than most recruits, but his expertise was valuable. He enlisted in the army, expecting to serve as an infantryman like thousands of other men flooding recruitment offices. Instead, the army recognized his potential. With America suddenly needing to feed millions of soldiers, the Quartermaster Corps desperately sought men with large-scale food service experience. 3 weeks after basic training, Haritos found himself at Fort Lee, Virginia, training as a mess sergeant. The standardized army approach to feeding troops frustrated him immediately. Field Manual FM 1020 prescribed cooking methods designed by bureaucrats with little practical experience. The M1937 field kitchen, the Army's primary feeding system, was inefficient by design, prioritizing durability and transportability over output. "This is how we've always done it," Master Sergeant Williams told Haritos when he suggested improvements. "The Army isn't a Chicago restaurant, son." Haritos kept his ideas to himself after that, excelling in training while mentally redesigning every procedure. He graduated top of his class and received orders to the 4th Infantry Division, a unit destined for the invasion of Europe. The skills he had developed in his family's busy restaurant, refined in Chicago's largest hotel kitchen, and tempered with engineering principles, would soon save thousands of soldiers from hunger and malnutrition in the muddy fields of France. But first, Haritos would have to convince the army that the impossible was possible, that feeding an entire division hot meals in combat conditions wasn't just a dream, but a necessity that could be achieved through one man's revolutionary approach to military cooking. March 3, 1944. Fort Benning, Georgia. The problem stared Haritos in the face every day. Feeding armies had always been a numbers game that nobody had solved. A single division, roughly 15,000 soldiers, required 45,000 meals daily. 3 hot meals meant 15 tons of food, 3,000 gallons of water, and 1,500 gallons of fuel for cooking stoves. And that was just one division among dozens. The Army has been trying to solve this since Washington crossed the Delaware, Captain Reynolds explained during advanced training at Fort Benning. He pointed to diagrams on the classroom wall showing field kitchen setups from different wars. Napoleon said armies march on their stomachs, but nobody's figured out how to fill those stomachs efficiently. The standard M1937 field kitchen, nicknamed the meat grinder by the cooks forced to use it, consisted of 2 large metal cabinets mounted on a 2-wheel trailer. Each unit contained a wood-burning stove that heated metal containers for soup, coffee, and main dishes. The Army designed it to feed 250 men per meal cycle, requiring 6 hours of preparation and cooking time. "Think about that math," Haritos whispered to Johnson, a fellow cook from Boston. "To feed a division, you need 60 field kitchens running simultaneously. That's 360 cooks and helpers spread across miles of territory." The history of military feeding made the challenge clear. During the Civil War, individual soldiers cooked their own rations over campfires, resulting in widespread stomach ailments and wasted food. World War I saw the first organized field kitchens, but they were stationary, forcing exhausted troops to walk miles for meals. The M1937 improved mobility, but sacrificed efficiency. Every failed system followed the same thinking, Haritos noted in his journal that night. They tried to make restaurant kitchens portable instead of rethinking how food should move from raw to ready in field conditions. Previous attempts at solutions had all failed. In 1942, the Army experimented with centralized kitchens that prepared food at rear positions and transported it to the front. But the food arrived cold and unappetizing. The British Army tried communal cooking pots that soldiers shared, a system that spread disease faster than it distributed food. Haritos spent his evenings analyzing every step in the Army's cooking process, breaking down each inefficiency. The biggest problem was what engineers called batch processing, cooking complete meals one pot at a time. When feeding hundreds or thousands, this approach created massive bottlenecks. "What if we stopped thinking about meals and started thinking about components?" Haritos sketched in his notebook. A line drawing showed food moving through stations rather than cooks moving around food. In his system, each cook would perform one specialized task repeatedly instead of completing entire recipes. The technical hurdles were enormous. Standard field stoves couldn't maintain the consistent temperatures his system required. The layout of Army kitchens didn't allow for the continuous flow he envisioned. And most critically, the entire approach violated Quartermaster Corps doctrine that had remained unchanged since 1918. Without authorization, Haritos began modifying equipment during night shifts. He adjusted fuel lines to increase heat output by 40%. He fashioned stainless steel dividers that transformed single large pots into multiple cooking chambers. He designed a gravity-fed water system that eliminated the need for hand-filling cooking vessels. "What the hell are you doing to my equipment?" Master Sergeant Williams discovered Haritos' unauthorized modifications during a midnight inspection. "Improving it, Sergeant," Haritos replied, not looking up from the welding torch he'd borrowed from the motor pool. "This setup will triple our output without requiring additional personnel." "You're going to get court-martialed," Williams warned. The Army doesn't appreciate creative thinking about established procedures. Yet Williams didn't report the modifications. Like everyone preparing for the invasion of Europe, he understood the looming feeding crisis that awaited Allied forces in France. The massive buildup of troops in England created logistical nightmares that traditional methods couldn't solve. The approaching D-Day invasion would require feeding hundreds of thousands of soldiers under combat conditions, across shifting front lines, often without reliable supply chains. What Haritos was developing wasn't just a cooking system. It was a potential solution to one of the war's most persistent problems. If the army couldn't feed its fighting men, all the tanks, planes, and rifles in the world wouldn't matter. And despite the risk to his military career, Haritos continued refining his system, unaware that in just 3 months, the muddy fields of Normandy would provide the ultimate test of his theories. July 15, 1944. Saint-Lô, Normandy, France. Dawn broke over the muddy field kitchen as Haritos assembled his team of 20 cooks and KPs. The night had passed without sleep as he finalized modifications to the standard equipment, creating what he now called the continuous flow cooking system. The men exchanged skeptical glances as Haritos outlined his radical approach. "This isn't how we were trained, Sergeant," Specialist Morris objected, examining the reconfigured field stoves arranged in a straight line rather than the standard circular formation. "Quartermaster will have our heads." "Quartermaster isn't feeding 3,000 men in 90 minutes, Haritos replied, checking the modified fuel lines he had installed overnight. Captain Reynolds authorized a test. 1 company, B Company, 2nd Battalion. If we fail, it's just my head. The system looked nothing like standard army procedure. Haritos had transformed 6 M1937 field kitchens into specialized stations. The first handled only meat preparation, the second vegetables, the third starches, the fourth sauces, the fifth assembly, and the 6th serving. Each cook performed just one task repeatedly, rather than preparing complete meals. "Think of it like Ford's assembly line, but for food," Haritos explained, positioning men at their stations. "No one moves from their position. The food moves, not the cooks." At 0530 hours, B Company's 150 men formed a line for the experimental breakfast. Captain Reynolds watched with arms crossed, stopwatch in hand. Colonel Whitaker stood nearby, his expression clearly communicating the consequences of failure. "Begin," Reynolds ordered, clicking his stopwatch. Haritos's system lurched into motion. Raw potatoes entered the first station, moving through a series of hands that peeled, chopped, and boiled them with mechanical efficiency. Eggs cracked 4 at a time by cooks who did nothing else. Bacon cooked on modified griddles that Haritos had expanded to triple standard capacity. Then disaster struck. The fuel line to Station 3 ruptured, sending flames shooting 3 feet high. Specialist Jenkins dropped his ladle and jumped back as fire engulfed the cooking surface. "System failure!" Morris called out, moving to return to traditional methods. "Stay at your stations!" Haritos barked, grabbing a fire extinguisher and dousing the flames. In 30 seconds, he had bypassed the damaged line and reconnected the fuel supply. The delay cost precious minutes, but the flow resumed. Plates began emerging from the final station. Complete breakfasts assembled from components that had never touched the same cooking surface. The innovation wasn't just in arrangement, but in timing. Traditional methods cooked complete meals sequentially. Haritos' system produced individual components continuously. "First meal complete," Reynolds announced, checking his watch. 7 minutes, 14 seconds from start to service. The line continued moving. 10 minutes later, all 150 men of B Company had received hot breakfast. The entire process, including the fire delay, had taken 17 minutes and 42 seconds. Less than 1/3 the time required using standard methods. Colonel Whitaker approached the final station, examining a plate before taking a tentative bite of scrambled eggs. His eyebrows raised slightly, the only indication of approval his stern demeanor would allow. "Acceptable," he pronounced, setting down his fork. "Prepare to feed the entire regiment tomorrow morning. Same timeline." The regimental test would involve feeding 3,000 men, 20 times the number they had just served. Haritos immediately began calculating the adjustments needed to scale the system. More stations, more specialized tasks, precise timing that would require rehearsal throughout the night. "Sir, we'll need additional equipment," Haritos told Captain Reynolds after Whitaker departed. "And I need 12 more men." "You'll get 6 men and whatever equipment you can scrounge from the maintenance battalion," Reynolds replied. "Make it work, Sergeant." Through the night, Haritos and his team expanded the system, creating 3 parallel production lines that would operate simultaneously. The lessons from the morning's test, particularly the vulnerable fuel lines, informed each modification. By 0400 hours, 27 cooking stations stood ready in precise alignment, each manned by a cook who had practiced his specific task for hours. At 0530, the test began. 3,000 men of the 12th Regiment formed 3 lines, each feeding into one of Haritos's production systems. The first hot meal emerged exactly 6 minutes after the command to begin. The last soldier received his breakfast 78 minutes later. Colonel Whitaker stood at the end of the line, witnessing a miracle of logistics. An entire regiment fed hot food in under 90 minutes using the same amount of equipment and fuel that traditionally required 6 hours. The ridiculous system that violated every principle of Army cooking doctrine had just revolutionized field feeding. "Get this system to every company in the division," Whitaker ordered Reynolds, "and get Sergeant Haritos to Division HQ. General Collins needs to see this immediately." Within 24 hours, Haritos found himself demonstrating his system to the commanding general of 7 Corps, who recognized immediately the tactical advantage of feeding entire divisions efficiently. The continuous flow cooking system was about to transform the American advance across France, ensuring that no soldier would fight on an empty stomach again. December 16, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees below zero as Haritos surveyed his kitchens through swirling snow. The German offensive had begun at 0530 that morning, a massive, unexpected assault that would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. Artillery shells screamed overhead, impacting with thunderous concussions that rattled cookware and sent men diving for cover. "Keep working!" Haritos shouted over the explosions. "These men need hot food now more than ever!" The 101st Airborne Division had been rushed to Bastogne to hold the critical crossroads town against the German advance. Thousands of men had arrived without winter clothing, adequate ammunition, or medical supplies. But thanks to Haritos' system, they would not fight without hot meals. The extreme conditions tested every aspect of the continuous flow cooking system. Metal components froze solid overnight. Fuel lines gelled in the Arctic temperatures. Water for cooking had to be melted from snow. Even the food itself arrived frozen, requiring additional preparation time. "Sergeant, we're down to our last 1,000 gallons of fuel," Corporal Morris reported, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "At current consumption rates, we'll be out by tomorrow evening." Haritos made rapid calculations. "Cut the fuel mixture to 60%. Extend the cooking cycle by 8 minutes per station, and insulate all external components with whatever blankets we can find." The improvised solutions multiplied as the siege of Bastogne intensified. When beef ran out, Haritos substituted local livestock requisitioned from Belgian farms. When standard cooking oil froze solid, he rendered fat from bacon to keep the system operational. When German artillery destroyed 2 complete cooking stations, he reconfigured the workflow to maintain production with reduced capacity. The human element proved as challenging as the technical problems. Haritos's kitchen crews worked 16-hour shifts in temperatures that caused frostbite within minutes of exposed skin. Men rotated through warming tents, never stopping the continuous flow of food production. "My fingers don't work anymore, Sarge," Private Jenkins complained, struggling to maintain his position on the vegetable preparation line. "Then use your palms," Haritos replied, demonstrating how to chop onions with frozen hands. "Those boys on the perimeter have it worse. They're fighting and freezing. We're just freezing." On December 22nd, the situation became dire. German forces had completely encircled Bastogne, cutting off all supply routes. General McAuliffe's famous reply to the German surrender demand, "Nuts," raised morale temporarily, but the reality remained grim. Food supplies dwindled to critical levels. The division had enough ammunition for 3 more days of fighting. Medical supplies were exhausted. General McAuliffe visited Haritos' kitchen area that evening, his face grave as he surveyed the operation. "Sergeant, I need to know exactly how long you can feed this division," he said quietly. Haritos had anticipated the question. 7 days at full rations, sir. 14 if we cut to half rations. 21 if we go to third rations, and I get permission to use some creative ingredients." "What kind of creative ingredients?" McAuliffe asked, eyebrow raised. "There are protein sources we normally wouldn't consider, sir," Haritos replied carefully. "But properly prepared, they're nutritious and unrecognizable in stew." McAuliffe studied the Greek-American sergeant's face, understanding the implication. "Do what you need to do, Sergeant. These men need strength to hold this position." On December 23rd, Haritos's kitchens produced what the men would later call mystery stew, a thick, hearty concoction that contained horse meat, local root vegetables, and ingredients sourced from locations Haritos declined to specify. The calorie count remained consistent with Army standards. The protein content actually exceeded regulations. No one asked questions about the source. The weather worsened on Christmas Eve. Temperatures plummeted to 20 below zero. Snow accumulated at a rate of 3 inches per hour. Standard Army field kitchens would have failed completely under such conditions, but Haritos's modified system continued functioning. His innovations had created redundancies and thermal efficiencies that proved crucial in the extreme environment. Christmas morning brought the distant sound of tank engines from the south, Patton's Third Army breaking through to relieve Bastogne. By noon, the first Sherman tanks entered the town, carrying desperately needed supplies. General Patton himself visited the 101st positions on December 26th, meeting with McAuliffe and touring the defensive perimeter. When he encountered Haritos's kitchen operation, still producing hot meals amid the devastation, he paused to observe the efficiency of the continuous flow system. "I've heard about your setup," Patton told Haritos, watching as hundreds of meals moved through the production line. "My quartermasters tell me you've been feeding 50,000 men daily throughout this entire goddamn mess." "Yes, sir," Haritos replied. "The system works in any conditions if you understand the principles." Patton nodded, sampling a bowl of the now infamous stew. "Every general since Alexander has known that armies fight on their stomachs, Sergeant. You've just figured out how to keep those stomachs full when nobody else could." The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month, but the crisis at Bastogne had passed. The 101st Airborne had held the crucial crossroads against overwhelming German force, an achievement that military historians would attribute partly to the maintenance of hot food service throughout the siege. Soldiers fighting in sub-zero conditions required nearly 4,000 calories daily to maintain combat effectiveness. Haritos's system had delivered those calories when conventional wisdom said it couldn't be done. As Patton departed, he left Haritos with words that would eventually adorn the training manual for the system. "In war, the ridiculous often becomes the essential. Remember that, Sergeant." June 6, 1994. Normandy, France. Demetrios Haritos stood on Omaha Beach, his weathered hands gripping the handle of a cane that supported his 83-year-old frame. 50 years had passed since D-Day, since he had landed on this beach with the second wave, carrying modified cooking equipment instead of weapons. The commemoration ceremony had ended hours ago, but Haritos remained, watching the waves crash against the shore as they had on that bloody morning in 1944. "Mr. Haritos?" A young army captain approached, offering a respectful salute. "Sir, the Secretary of the Army would like to speak with you before the dedication ceremony." Haritos nodded, following slowly. The dedication would officially name the Army's new advanced culinary training facility at Fort Lee, Virginia, as the Demetrios Haritos Center for Combat Feeding Systems, recognition that had come 5 decades after his innovations changed military logistics forever. The impact of Haritos's continuous flow cooking system extended far beyond World War II. By 1945, all American military branches had adopted modified versions of his approach. The Korean War saw the introduction of the M1959 field kitchen, a system built specifically around Haritos' principles, capable of feeding 300 men per hour with just 2 operators. In Vietnam, the mobile kitchen trailer incorporated hydraulic components that automated many of the processes Haritos had originally assigned to specialized cooks. The modern combat field feeding system, too, used in Iraq and Afghanistan, could trace its lineage directly to those desperate improvisations in the muddy fields of Normandy. Though sleeker and more technologically advanced, it maintained the fundamental principle that revolutionized military feeding: continuous flow production rather than batch cooking. When I visited troops during Desert Storm, the Secretary of the Army told Haritos at the dedication ceremony, "I watch kitchens feed entire battalions in under an hour. Every soldier who has deployed since 1944 has benefited from your innovation." Haritos's return to civilian life after the war had been remarkably successful. Using the principles he developed for military feeding, he established Haritos Catering Systems in Chicago in 1946. The company specialized in high-volume food service for stadiums, convention centers, and corporate dining facilities. By 1960, his operations fed over 100,000 people daily across the Midwest. When he sold the company to a conglomerate in 1978, it had expanded to 23 states. The irony, Haritos often told culinary students during his guest lectures at the Culinary Institute, is that the Army wanted nothing to do with my system initially. Sometimes the most valuable innovations come from breaking the rules. Military historians analyzing the European campaign eventually recognized the logistical significance of Haritos's contribution. Studies conducted in the 1970s concluded that the continuous flow cooking system had reduced field kitchen personnel requirements by 40%, while increasing production capacity by 300%. This efficiency allowed the redeployment of thousands of service personnel from cooking duties to combat support roles, an advantage that accelerated the Allied advance across Europe. More significantly, nutritional analysis confirmed that units with access to Haritos' system maintained significantly higher combat effectiveness during extended operations. The ability to deliver hot, nutritionally complete meals 3 times daily, even during rapid advances or defensive crises like Bastogne, measurably improved soldier performance, reduced cold weather casualties, and decreased combat fatigue incidents. Food isn't just calories, Haritos explained to a documentary filmmaker in 1987. It's morale. It's connection to home. It's the message that someone cares whether you live or die. That's why I fought so hard to make the system work. The technical aspects of Haritos's innovation eventually found applications beyond military settings. Modern fast food production borrowed heavily from his continuous flow methodology. Hospital feeding systems, airline catering operations, and institutional food service all incorporated elements first developed in those improvised field kitchens of 1944. At the Pentagon in 1995, a small museum display was installed featuring one of the original modified M1937 field stoves Haritos had created. The placard beside it contained a quote from General Patton's memoirs. 3 innovations proved decisive in the European theatre: the proximity fuse, the P-51 Mustang, and Sergeant Haritos's cooking system. Without any one of them, victory would have been significantly delayed. Demetrios Haritos died peacefully in his Chicago home on March 17, 1997, at age 86. His funeral was attended by representatives from every branch of the military, former members of his cooking teams, and hundreds of veterans who had benefited from his innovation. The Army Honor Guard that carried his casket included 6 culinary specialists, recognition that food service personnel were essential to military effectiveness. Today, every soldier who completes advanced culinary training receives a manual entitled The Haritos Principles of Field Feeding. The first page contains the simple philosophy that guided the Greek immigrant cook from Chicago. Feeding an army isn't about the recipe, it's about the system. Each year at Fort Lee, the Haritos Award recognizes the military cook who develops the most significant innovation in field feeding technology. The trophy is a miniature replica of that first modified field kitchen. A reminder that sometimes the most transformative ideas are initially dismissed as ridiculous. 50,000 soldiers fed daily during the Battle of the Bulge. 3 million hot meals served during the advance from Normandy to Germany. Countless lives saved through improved nutrition and morale. All because one cook refused to accept that feeding an army under combat conditions was impossible. As modern military planners face new logistical challenges in increasingly complex theatres of operation, they continue to apply the fundamental insight that Demetrios Haritos discovered in the mud of Normandy. Sometimes the solution isn't a better recipe, but a better system.